This is Right to Life Radio with John Girardi on Power Talk 96.7 and AM 1400, a production of the Right to Life of Central California. And now, here's your host, John Girardi.
Right to Life Radio is proudly sponsored by Dizon Medicine and Dizon Medicine Urgent Care Plus. Thank you to the various deep voice men. This is Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 and AM 1400, a production, as always, of Right to Life of Central California, RTLCC.org. All right, folks. Jonathan's not here. Even producer Raphael's not here. I'm flying as solo can be. It feels like an episode of the John Girardi Show, frankly. And what I wanted to talk about today is, this is a talk, more or less, this is a talk that I gave earlier this week to a great camp of pro-life kids in Southern California. This is a group called Vox Vitae. And I did it on the topic of basically what you can do to increase your voice, your political activism on behalf of the pro-life cause. Basically, I think a lot of people are wildly ignorant about state government, about the role of the California state legislature. In the United States of America, we live under a system called federalism. And in federalism, we have two sovereigns. We have the federal government, who governs us from Washington, D.C., and we have the state government that governs us from Sacramento. And there are limited and enumerated things that the federal government can do, and only the federal government can do. Only the federal government can issue coinage, have a military, etc., regulate commerce between states, whereas the state governments have much broader power. State governments have what's called the police power, the limited and enumerated things that the federal government can do. We have listed in this thing called the U.S. Constitution. That's what the Constitution is. It is a document giving a limited and enumerated listing of all the stuff that the federal government can do. So these are the things that the federal government can do. Pretty much everything else state governments can do. Now, things have changed over the course of since 1789, when the U.S. Constitution came into effect. Things have changed quite a bit since the Constitution was originally ratified. The federal government has grown massively in terms of its power and scope and its ability to regulate stuff. And certainly, there is a much bigger focus on national politics than on state politics. A lot of this has to do with communications media being more widespread. A lot of this has to do with the fact that Fox News is not going to cover, CNN is not going to cover what happens at the Alabama State House. They're going to cover what's happening in Washington. So news has become nationalized. Media has become nationalized. And the federal government has expanded its power enormously over the course of the last 200 plus years. Particularly the Interstate Commerce Clause. The Constitution says that Congress can pass laws regulating commerce between the various states, interstate commerce. And in an era before railroads, in an era before interstate highways, in an era before the internet, interstate commerce meant a whole lot less than it does now. Obviously, a lot more stuff is part of interstate commerce. Regardless, the federal government's power has grown, but that doesn't mean that state government isn't really important. In fact, state government is still really, really critically, drastically important. And what state governments do can have a profound impact on our lives and has a profound impact on abortion law. Okay, different states have different kinds of abortion rates, and different states have different kinds of abortion laws. While Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey don't allow state governments to totally ban abortion even for any chunk of the pregnancy, state governments still have an enormous ability to regulate abortion, to favor abortion, to disfavor abortion. And it's something that we have to be really, really concerned about as pro-life citizens, that basically we need to keep tabs on what kinds of bills are introduced in the California state legislature, what kinds of things are they trying to do, and how we can make our voice heard. So what's going to happen on today's show, it's going to be a mixture of a couple of things. Is one, a kind of civics lesson about the California State Legislature and how the California State Legislature works. Okay, so let's talk about the California State Legislature. Now, by show of hands, looking out at my vast radio audience, I can see all of you through the radios. Yes, you. Yes, you, Betty, messing with your hair. No, I can't see any of you. Sorry, it's radio. Looking out upon my radio audience, how many of you remember Schoolhouse Rock? How many of you remember the Schoolhouse Rock cartoon? I'm just a Bill. Yes, I'm only a Bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. I see a large show of hands. Most of you remember. You know how a law is made in Washington, D.C., or at least in its big strokes. You have the House of Representatives, which represents all the people of the United States proportionately according to their populations. Then you have the United States Senate, which has 100 members. Every state gets 2 senators. And basically, a bill can't become a law unless a majority in the House votes for it, a majority in the Senate votes for it, and then if the president signs it. That's how we make laws that govern us in the United States of America. The California State Legislature is very similar. California State Legislature, instead of a House of Representatives, it has the California State Assembly. This is the lower house. The California State Assembly has 80 members, representing all 40 million Californians, 80 members, and they are one of our 2 legislative bodies. Much like the U.S. Congress has the Senate, we in California also have a state Senate. The Senate is our upper house, and the Senate has 40 members. The California State Senate has 40 members. Now, both the State Assembly and the State Senate their representatives are allocated based on population percentages, okay? So our 40 U.S. senators, each senator represents roughly 1 million California residents. Our California Assembly members, there are 80 of them. Each one represents roughly 500,000 residents. And I'll talk a little bit later in the show about why I think that's messed up. California's numbers about how many people each member of the Assembly and Senate represents. California has some really screwed up numbers in that regard. But that's a story for another day. So the way that it works in California is that you need a majority of the California State Assembly to vote on something, a majority of the California State Senate to vote on something, on that same piece of legislation, and then you need the governor to sign it into office. The governor functions in California in a fashion that's very similar to how the president functions within the federal government, okay? The U.S. Congress is the legislative branch of government. The U.S. Congress drafts our laws. The president is in charge of the executive branch of government. He enforces our laws. Very similarly, in California, the California State Legislature, the Assembly and the Senate, they write our laws, and then the governor executes our laws, enforces our laws. So the basic structure of state governments, and including California's state government, is very similar to how the U.S. Congress works. And this is all, it has all of the positive features, it has all the negative features of Congress. Members of the California State Legislature get assailed by lobbyists, people who are paid to advocate for a certain industry, for certain positions, all the time. In fact, Sacramento is probably the best bang for your lobbying buck you can possibly get in the country. It's a very small group of people, only 120 legislators, who are making legislation that impacts 40 million people. It's a hotbed for lobbyists trying to do all kinds of things, whether it's lobbyists for labor unions, lobbyists for different industries like oil, marijuana, PG&E. It's tons of lobbyists. There are all these, Greenpeace, the abortion industry. There are all kinds of groups that have lobbying outfits that go to Sacramento to try to lobby members of the state assembly and state legislature and try to get the most bang for their buck or try to lobby the governor directly. Now, the California legislative calendar is, so basically, California's legislature operates according to an annual calendar beginning roughly in December and going through roughly the end of August, September. okay? So over the course of the year, the California legislature has a number of deadlines that it has to meet. If a bill is written by a member of the assembly, it has to go through several committees. Okay, if you write a bill about, let's say you write some kind of criminal bill, well, there are certain California committees, legislative committees that it has to go through. And committees within the California Assembly or the California Senate are small groups of assembly members and senators who are focused on certain subject areas. Okay, so there's there's in both the state Senate and the state Assembly, there is, for an example, an Assembly Committee on Higher Education. There's an Assembly Health Committee. There's Assembly Judiciary Committee for stuff that might impact the law. There is the Assembly, the Appropriations Committee, which has to do with any legislation that's going to spend money. So any piece of legislation is going to get assigned. So you have an idea. You bring it to your state assembly person. And from roughly December through February, your assembly member or your senator has time to write a bill. They write out a bill. They get people to help them. Maybe they get ideas from you as a citizen. Maybe they get ideas from someone else. They write a bill. They introduce it sometime before February. The bill will then get assigned to one or more committees in the House where it was introduced. If you're a senator and you write a bill, it has to go through certain Senate committees. So over the course of the next several months, you will have hearings in different committees. Maybe you have a hearing in the Judiciary Committee. You bring you speak on behalf of your bill. You bring witnesses to speak on behalf of your bill. Maybe people dislike your bill. Maybe they send witnesses to speak in opposition to your bill. And the committee then votes on whether or not your bill is going to advance. Then it goes to the next relevant committee. Maybe you have something that has to be heard in the Health Committee and in the Higher Education Committee. So it has to pass all of those committees. If you know that it's not going to pass in a committee, maybe you hold off and wait until you can make amendments to the bill as the bill goes along. Finally, in roughly April or May, there's a final vote on the floor of your house. If your bill has passed through all those committees and passed through the Appropriations Committee, if it's going to spend money, that's always the last committee. If your bill spends money, it has to go through the Appropriations Committee. Then there's a vote on the floor of the House where you introduced it. If you're a senator, on the floor of your House, the Senate. And then it goes to the next House. And the next House goes through the same process. It has to go through all the different committees. Finally, it gets to the floor of the House towards the end of the session in August or early September. That House will have a final vote on it. Now, if amendments were made between when the full Senate voted on it, and then when the full Assembly voted on it, it has to go back to the Senate so that they both houses have to pass the exact same piece of legislation. They have to pass the exact same verbiage. Once the legislative session is done, towards late August, early September, the bill goes to the governor. And so the whole legislative session for the Assembly and the Senate ends on the exact same day. All of the business that the legislature wants to accomplish, all the bills they want to pass, they all have to be done towards the end of August or in early to mid-September. And there's always a set date every year when it has to happen. From that date, the governor has a month. He has 1 month to sign or veto all of the bills, all of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bills that the California legislature passed over the course of the legislative session. The governor has to sign all of them in the course of that 1 month. So what you can see is that there are a number of points where critical decisions are made. There are decisions made when the bill is introduced at the individual committees in the House of Origin for that bill. There is a decision to be made when that bill is voted on the floor of that House. Then when it goes to the opposite House, there are decisions made at all those different committee hearings. And finally, when it's voted on the floor there, then another decision when maybe if an amendment was made and you have to reconcile the House version, the version passed in the Assembly with the version passed in the Senate, they have to reconcile it and vote on one same thing. And then you can intervene at the level of the governor. So there are just a bunch of different points where people can intervene. Now, what I want to talk about in the next segment is how you can intervene, how you can expand your voice in order to play a part in the state legislative process. We're going to dig into that really in depth next. Right to Life Radio, right here on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400, a production, as always, of Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. So one of the things I love telling people is how they can expand their voice when it comes to politics, and especially when it comes to pro-life stuff. How can you be politically active? How can you increase your voice? And I want to just talk about this very simply with you. Now, on the one hand, in California, it looks bleak. We have state assembly members who represent us at the California Legislature, which writes laws for us in California. We have state assembly members who represent us and state senators who represent us. And I guess that most of you don't know who your state assembly member is and who your state senator is. So one thing I'd encourage all of you to do is go to findyourrep.legislature.ca.gov, type in your address, and you'll find out who represents you. That's one of the first things to do. And now for me, I live in Clovis, so my representatives in the assembly, my assembly member is Jim Patterson, who's the former mayor of Fresno. He's now a California State Assembly member. And my state senator is Andreas Borges. So how do I make my voice heard in Sacramento? Now, you might think to yourself, I'm just one person in a state of 40 million people. What do people care? What do people care about what I have to say? Well, let me just have you think through the impact of your voice in state politics and the state legislative process. Now, in the last segment, I talked about there are all these different points where legislators have to vote on legislation. A bill gets introduced. It has to go through several committees where different members of the Assembly or the Senate vote on it. It gets voted on the floor of the House where it was introduced, either the Assembly and the Senate, and then the process repeats itself in the opposite House. All the different committees, then finally at the floor again. You can call your assembly member, you can call your senator at any of those points before your assembly member or senator votes on it to make your voice heard. Now, if you say, what does my voice matter? Then you've just guaranteed that you have zero voice. You have made your cynical assessment of the situation true. So how do you have a voice? Let's go through the ways in which you have a voice. First, you have a vote. That gives you some voice. So if you don't vote, you have zero voice, zero outcome on how pro-life or anti-life legislation gets passed or made in the California State Legislature. If you don't vote, you have guaranteed that you have no voice, no say in anything. But let's say you vote. Okay, you have one voice. Some people vote, and they also read up on things and learn a lot about politics, especially about pro-life legislation and stuff, and talk with friends and family about it, give recommendations for who's actually pro-life. Those people maybe have 5 or 10 voices. They have the power, the impact of 5 or 10 normal people. But there are some people who take the extra step of calling their assembly members, calling their state senators, or calling members of the U.S. House of Representatives before they vote on something. Those people have the impact of literally hundreds of people. Okay, because let me give you the reality of how state legislative offices work. They introduce a piece of legislation, or there's some piece of legislation that's out there. And if the state legislative office for a member of the assembly, if their office gets 200 calls from angry constituents saying, you better not vote yes on AB 123, or SB 321, or whatever it is, whatever the bill number is. That's how bills are labeled in California. AB, which means assembly bill, and then the number is in the order of all of the pieces of legislation that were introduced in the assembly, or in the Senate. So AB 123 means this is the 123rd bill introduced in the assembly. It's Assembly Bill 123. Anyway, so there's assembly bills and Senate bills. If 100 people call a state legislative office and say, you'd better not vote yes on this bill, and it's only 100 people saying you'd better not vote yes, well, that member of the state assembly can do some basic math and figure, okay, if 100 people called me, that must mean there are thousands of people in my district who haven't called me but are still angry about it. But so many people were angry about this that they thought to call me. So I'm going to assume that this person represents the voices of this one person who called represents the voice of maybe several hundred constituents. So you have just by making a 5-second phone call to your state assembly member, and it's easy. Just look up your state assembly member's name and phone number. Then call the Sacramento office and you're in. With a 10-second phone call saying, I'm a constituent, I live at such and such and such and such within your district. I want you to vote no on assembly bill, whatever. Thank you. 10 seconds of your time, and you've magnified your voice in the political process by 100-fold. Literally, by 100-fold. All right, when we return, I'm going to talk about some of the horrible bills in front of the state legislature, including particularly the buffer zone bill, SB 742, but also there's a whole bunch of other bills that show how we can't really just be neutral towards the abortion question in California. That's next on Right to Life Radio on Power Talk. Okay, I'm going to talk about several of the bad bills that are before the California legislature, and I'm doing it not so much for the bills themselves. I mean, they're kind of self-explanatory. We at Right to Life have done what we can to oppose the possibly defeatable ones. But I do it as a way of sort of talking about the ways in which your state legislature is really important when it comes to abortion. And to maybe combat this kind of facile approach that I see sometimes with abortion legislation. So let me sort of break this down. I've seen this in the context of, like, even sometimes people talking about the whole Catholic conversation about refusing Holy Communion to politicians who are Catholics but support abortion rights. Some people say, well, look, what legislators do doesn't have much to do with abortion. Look, abortion was already decided by the Supreme Court. It's settled. There's really not much to be done here. Well, I don't think that's correct, because there is one of the things to understand about law is that law has a profound educative effect on society, and that educative effect can be expressed. The government can express its kind of viewpoint, give a kind of educative stance to the people that the government serves or the people that the government governs along a very wide spectrum. How does the government view something? It's a big, wide spectrum of how the government views an individual practice. Let's just look at the different ways in which abortion, for example, was treated. Abortion was not very commonly done. There were maybe a few in the early founding of our country. Abortion was not commonly done. There weren't explicit statutes on the books banning it. People weren't exactly sure when human life in the womb began. There were some court cases that were sort of negative towards it, but it just wasn't a very commonplace practice in all likelihood. Then around the time of the Civil War, the various states, around the time of the U.S. Civil War, after we began to learn exactly when mammalian life begins at the moment of egg-sperm fusion, pretty much every state in the Union, around the time before, during, after the Civil War, passed laws criminalizing abortion. And so the state had a certain viewpoint towards abortion. And that viewpoint would shift. It would be permitted in some circumstances. Then by the time we get to 1973, boom, it is completely permitted. But then immediately in 1976, we say, okay, it's permitted, but no one's going to federally fund it. The government's not going to federally fund it. And then eventually that starts to break down. And different states start passing laws to help abortion, to increase abortion access, to subsidize abortion, to make abortion more affordable. And just looking at the history of abortion, we go from total criminal prohibitions to government funding and full legality with no restrictions. Do you see how there's a whole spectrum of ways in which the state can treat it? It's not simply something's legal or not illegal. There's a whole spectrum of ways you can treat it. There are a variety of criminal penalties you can assess. There are ways you can say it's disfavored and maybe not criminalized, but certainly disfavored. There are ways in which it can be legally permitted and not favored, not funded, but then also funded with federal dollars. there's just a huge, broad spectrum of postures that the government can take towards abortion, even when it's legal. Even when it's legal, you can see how different states take such radically different postures towards abortion. In California, we roll out the red carpet for abortion. We roll out the red carpet for abortion providers. We say that nurse practitioner midwives can do abortions. You don't have to actually even be a doctor to do abortions. We're going to facilitate mailing abortion pills. We're going to facilitate telemedicine services to get abortion. We do everything possible here in California to make abortion easier. We don't require minors to receive parental authorization or parental notification even before they can go have an abortion. We do everything within our power to make abortion easier. And one of the big ways in which we do this is through funding. So this is the point that I'm trying to make here, is that law has a profoundly educative effect on the populace. Look, before Roe v. Wade, most people were not really super big abortion zealots, okay? Before Roe v. Wade, most people were not big abortion supporters. Within 10 years of Roe, within 15 years of Roe, huge majorities of Americans were pro-choice. And it was only in the 90s and the 2000s, especially during the partial birth abortion debates, that public perception really changed. And now we're more at sort of a 50-50 split. So with that in mind, I want to just give a list of some of the worst pro-choice bills that are on the docket that the state legislature is considering. Thankfully, they're in a recess right now. And I'm doing this not so much for the bills themselves. Obviously, I think you should call your representative, urge them to vote no. It's difficult in California, though, because, frankly, Democrats have a 3/4 majority in both houses of the legislature. They have literally, in the state Senate, Democrats have a 31-9 majority. Now, not to say every Democrat is pro-choice or that every Republican is pro-life, but that's largely how the division is. And that's sort of the pro-choice, pro-life divide that we see. So let me go over just some of these things, just to give you an example of the kinds of ways in which the state can promote the abortion viewpoint. Let's talk about Assembly Bill 1184. Assembly Bill 1184, AB 1184. This legislation prohibits insurance companies from letting parents or guardians know when one of their minor children uses their parents' insurance to get an abortion or to get contraception. So your kid is on your health insurance plan that you earn through your job or that you pay for. Your kid on that plan gets an abortion without telling you. Your insurance company is required to keep that from you. That's the extent that they're going to go. So the state is taking this posture of minors have to have abortions. They have to have abortions without their parents telling them. We're going to have that as the default setting, that a minor can keep that information from her parent. And not only are we not going to inform the parent, not only are we not going to ask for the parent's consent, we're not even going to let the parent know that he or she is paying for that abortion. Now, how do we know about that? So this is also accompanied. There's another piece of legislation, SB 245. This legislation prohibits any woman with insurance from having to pay any out-of-pocket expenses for abortion. It shifts those costs to insurance companies, and to insurance companies we mean Medi-Cal, and by Medi-Cal we mean taxpayers. And it effectively makes abortion free for anyone in California who has insurance. And any pregnant woman in California qualifies for Medi-Cal. So let's get a sense educatively of what the state of California is saying. You know how much it costs in California to have a baby? On most insurances, it costs a bit, all right? Insurance does not cover every single cost, all right? There are deductibles, there are co-pays, there's out-of-pocket expenses. All right, know that for a fact. Having a baby is not free. Having a baby is not cheap. Even if you've got insurance, it's not free, it's not cheap. The state of California is more lavishly furnishing, paying for, funding you getting an abortion than they are you having a baby. What does that say? I mean, look, I know abortion is cheaper than having a baby. God knows it is. But at the same time, the state is... Look, this was one of the reasons why the California State Supreme Court, absurdly in the 1980s, prohibited our state legislature from cutting off state funding through Medi-Cal for abortion. The California State Legislature said, look, the state legislature cannot, it has to respect freedom of choice. It has to respect an individual woman's right to choose. And as a result, it cannot favor one choice over another as far as its spending. That was one of the rationales that the California State Supreme Court gave. So now, here's the California legislature paying 100% of the costs for having an abortion, or forcing insurance companies to shoulder the burden of 100% of the cost of an abortion. And meanwhile, so we are, obviously, this is the state, in a way, tilting the scales. It is tilting the scales in favor of abortion. It is making it so much easier, so much cheaper to get an abortion than it is to keep a baby. It's sick. Now, this is just one aspect of what the state wants to do. The state funding abortion by preventing any out-of-pocket payments for abortion, promoting abortion through covering up from insurance companies the fact that your minor daughter on your insurance is getting an abortion using your insurance. So they cover all this up. And let's just understand the rationale for why they're doing this. This is an important point that I repeat time and time again. The focus of the pro-choice movement is not on abortion being safe, legal, and rare. That's not what they want anymore. That was the language of the 90s. That was the language of the early aughts, and they have moved on from that language. I think Cecile Richards did a lot to change that over the course of her tenure as president of Planned Parenthood. Ma Richards' daughter, Cecile Richards. We don't believe in safe, legal, and rare anymore. Not on the pro-abortion side. They don't believe in safe, legal, and rare. As much as I dislike safe, legal, and rare as a formulation of how we should look at abortion, chiefly the legal part, I guess I don't object to safe. I just don't think it's something that should be done to begin with, so the safety aspect should just be irrelevant. The left rejects safe, legal, and rare. And the key thing they reject is rare. They don't think abortion should be rare. The mindset of supporting abortion as something safe, legal, and rare, while it was inadequate, at least led to a number of politicians, even on the Democrat side of the aisle, even on the pro-choice side of the aisle, agreeing that we should not fund abortion through federal taxpayer dollars. People like Joe Biden really claimed to have believed that, voted in support of that for years and years and years. Joe Biden, from basically 1977, when he entered the U.S. Senate, all the way through 2019, so through his entire career in the Senate, his entire career as vice president, supported the Hyde Amendment. And then in 2019, he changed his mind over the course of a literal 24-hour period when a bunch of Democrat activists yelled at him for continuing to endorse the Hyde Amendment. And so he changed his 40-year-long position on the Hyde Amendment in just a day. Why? Because they don't think abortion is something to be ashamed of. They think of abortion as essential women's health care. They think of abortion as a positive good. And as a positive good, as an essential part of women's health care, as an essential aspect of women's rights, of women's bodily autonomy, not only should it not be there's no reason for it to be rare. The focus is that abortion should be safe, legal, and universally, this is the buzzword, accessible. Accessibility. That is what they want for abortion. They want abortion to be safe, legal, and universally accessible. This is why they have done the stunt during COVID, which I'm sure will last forever, during COVID, of allowing abortion pills to be sent to women individually through the mail. That is why they are doing this stunt in the California legislature to eliminate any out-of-pocket expenses for abortion, to take away any barriers to minors getting abortions, like their parents knowing about it. That is the focus of the modern-day left. All right, when we return, an update on SB 742. We'll talk about it again here on the show. The buffer zone bill. That is next on Right to Life Radio, right here on Power Talk. I want to talk about Senate Bill 742 in this last segment of the show. Thank you all so much for listening, by the way. Senate Bill 742. Now, we've been talking a lot about the California legislature, the way in which the legislative process works, how to amplify your voice, and the ways in which our posture towards legislation impacts what we teach the people, the populace, about abortion. So, Senate Bill 742 is an insane piece of legislation. What this does, I was talking about it with my brother. My brother's also a lawyer. And we were discussing this possibility that, we're talking about a 100-foot buffer zone. This 100-foot buffer zone that Senate Bill 742 places around any vaccine site. Any vaccine site. And let's note that Planned Parenthood clinics, a lot of abortion clinics, are vaccine sites. They give HPV vaccines. This legislation says within 100 feet of a vaccine site, it prohibits various kinds of protest activity, which they label harassment. And basically, harassment consists of approaching someone with literature or in various other ways in connection with vaccine services. Now, what does that mean exactly? This bill is incredibly vague and I think incredibly poorly written and I think incredibly constitutionally problematic. Now, we at Right to Life Central California, we don't have all that much to say about vaccines. We've certainly talked about the COVID vaccines and what connection they may have to abortion. Again, if you want our recommendation, if you think you're at an at-risk person and you want to protect yourself with a vaccine, I'd opt towards Pfizer and Moderna rather than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine from kind of an ethical standpoint. But for the most part, we don't really care about HPV vaccines being offered at Planned Parenthood. That's not why we're out there. We're out there protesting abortion. And yet, if this legislation passes, so it outlaws all of this different kind of protest activity in regards to vaccines. I don't know what that means. Because we at Right to Life Central California, we have a ministry, a Sidewalk Ministry outside of Planned Parenthood, where throughout the week, we're there encouraging women to choose other options, giving information. Like, we're not there to talk about vaccines, but it is a vaccine clinic. It is a clinic that gives vaccines. Planned Parenthood gives HPV vaccines. It's one of the services. It's on their website. Trust me, we checked. And all of that stuff we're doing, it's a 100-foot buffer zone around the entrance to the clinic, but also a 30-foot buffer zone from any individual person going in. I can't approach within 30 feet of someone coming in. How can we even have a conversation with them? So I think the bill is incredibly poorly written. I don't know if someone's going in there for a vaccine. And furthermore, I think it involves the First Amendment in a lot of ways. So here's the classic way in which I think this piece of legislation is going to violate the First Amendment. The bill prohibits interacting with someone in relation to vaccines, coming within 100 feet of the clinic, coming within 30 feet of an individual in connection to vaccines. Presumably, this means that I could come within 100 feet of a clinic or 30 feet of a person to ask them what time it is or what the weather's going to be like next week. Or, who won the NBA Finals in, 1987. But I can't talk to them about vaccines. Maybe I can talk to them about abortion. I don't know. So if the government on public property within 100 feet of an abortion clinic, within 100 feet of a vaccine site, within 30 feet of an individual. If the government is telling you can't talk about X, isn't that a restriction on speech? Isn't that an infringement on my right to freedom of speech, which chiefly concerns questions of morality, ethics, politics? I think it is. So let's hope SB 742 fails. Call your representatives, urge them to vote no on Senate Bill 742. That'll do it for Right to Life Radio. We'll see you next week on Power Talk.